All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, as we have been discussing, the GOP Senate proposal is out, and it is absolutely, absurdly, pathetically, outrageously bad. There is no money for state and local governments, and oversight alone, which could lead to more than 5 million layoffs. Turns out that Mitch McConnell and the GOP are going to defund the police and the firefighters and teachers and sanitation workers and everyone else who earns a local government salary. They did decide to send out another one-time $1,200 check. I want to give them kudos on that. And they worked in important priorities like, I kid you not, allowing businesses to deduct meal and entertainment expenses. I can't decide whether I'm more outraged by how that particular item just shamelessly panders to business executives with fat expense accounts, or by the utter absurdity of it. What meals? What entertainment? It is a pandemic. No one can do anything, you idiots. For good measure, to make sure that you really knew their priorities were totally in line, they threw in $1.8 billion for a new FBI building in D.C. because apparently Trump wants to keep the FBI building in town next to his hotel property. Oh, and obviously the coveted corporate liability shield that the chamber and every other business interest has been fighting hard for. But the real sticking point, the big thing that stuck in the craw of the GOP caucus and the White House market fundamentalists, was the $600 plus up on unemployment insurance. Now remember, the whole reason we had that plus up to begin with was that typically unemployment only replaces somewhere around 45% of a worker's wages. Rather than try to revamp the whole state unemployment systems to figure out how to replace 100% of wages, they just decided to go for the easy fix of $600 per week on top of whatever the normal payout would be. Now, Republicans at the time, with the economy cratering and collapsing in real time, including their precious markets, even then they nearly tanked that bill because God forbid any worker get a few dollars more than what they had previously been earning. But business had way too much at stake in the CARES Act to let that one go down, so the GOP sucked it up and, horror of horrors, slightly eased the burden of some working class people. But they'll be damned if they let that one happen again, and so all of the wrangling and disarray and delay, which has not only created massive instability for the 20 to 30 million people who are currently depending on those payments, but also may well destroy the GOP's electoral prospects in November. That has been over how much can we possibly get away with screwing over these workers. That's the crux of the problem. Now, I've been listening to these people wring their hands about the debt and the deficit, and we've talked about it quite a bit here. Honestly, it's been perplexing to watch. Their election prospects depend on floating the American people until we can get to the other side of this pandemic. What are they thinking?
There was a technical problem where we were in emergency last time, so we instituted this quickly, and in certain cases, people were paid more to stay home than they were to work. And I think that's something that the American public understands. We're not going to use taxpayer money to pay people more to stay home. So we're going to transition to a UI system that is based upon wage replacement. We've talked about approximately 70% wage replacement, and we're just going through the mechanics of that.
We can justify aggressive borrowing and spending as necessary during times of crisis, but that can't be the default. That's why it's so critical that we get a hold of our debt and deficits once we emerge from this pandemic.
Look, we'll see where this ends up. We still don't know the details of this initial proposal, but as it's written right now, I'm not only a no, I'm a hell no.
And while normally it's Wall Street and corporate interests who are pushing that deficit hawk line and funding the trickle-down policy push, they're actually not. If you listen to what Wall Street analysts are actually saying, they are asking for a bigger stimulus because they're not idiots. And they recognize that consumer spending, on which the economy massively depends, has been propped up by the stimulus checks and, critically, that unemployment insurance that Congress passed back in the CARES Act. Yet the GOP, over the objections of at least some portion of their funders and certainly over the objections of the American public, are digging in their heels. Why? Well, if you think about it, since the Reagan era, GOP economics has been carefully constructed around essentially three central ideas, all of them elaborately crafted to ensure that they can muster some sort of cobbled together moral and economic argument in their quest to basically give everything away to rich people. So piece number one here is trickle down. This is, of course, the whole makers and takers idea, familiar to any two-bit Ayn Rand acolyte, that some special people are worthy because they create jobs and everyone else is just essentially a leech on their magnificent teats. Therefore, the goal of government should just be to get out of the way of these noble genius masters of the universe. And moreover, that the benefits of such a policy will flow down all of those workers, and thus a rising tide will lift all boats, blah, blah, blah. Now, no one can possibly believe that crap today, as we see so clearly how these supposedly courageous risk takers have actually had their downsides fully covered by the federal government. We propped up the market with $4 trillion. It is not trickling down. Piece number two here is the flip side of trickle down, which is demonizing the poor and the working class. Not only are the rich wonderful makers, but the poor are lazy takers who fundamentally deserve whatever they get. Now, this is often, of course, mixed in with some blatant racism, as in the welfare queen mythology, but the basic idea is if you aren't doing well, it is your own damn fault. Now, obviously, in the current situation, this strategy and justification for denying dignity to the working class is just not available. Government policy was literally to force people onto the unemployment rolls. Not to mention, it has become abundantly clear who is actually doing the real work on which our society depends. And so with those two bedrock legs of the conservative economic stool utterly decimated, they are left clinging desperately to the third, the myth of scarcity. This one says, sure, I'd like to spend the money, but we just don't have it. We gotta balance our budget just like a household balances their checkbook, or whatever dumb nonsensical analogy they use to compare a government that could literally mint $1 trillion coin tomorrow to your household budgeting. Yes, this leg also looks very shaky given the fact that when the markets needed it and big business needed it, trillions of dollars flowed like water. But you have to understand, this is all they have left. Without the myth of scarcity and the idea that they would love to end homelessness and for people to be able to live off the sweat of their full-time work and for everyone to have health care, but gosh darn it, think of the inflation in our grandchildren. Without that whole mythology, they really got nothing left. Nothing left to cling to from their 40 years of carefully crafting a made-up ideology, nothing left to say or to run on or to fall back on in their vapid political musings. Thus, rather than give the $600 unemployment plus up to their own voters, they're taking principled kamikaze missions to their own destruction. They would rather lose in a landslide than face the simple fact that there is no trickle down, no shame in being poor, and plenty of money to solve every problem that we'd care to solve. I'm actually having a problem with the self-immolation of the GOP, if I'm being honest. It's small penance for the havoc and pain that they have wrought over years. I just wish that the 30 million people on unemployment and every state and local government worker didn't have to pay the price. And that is the most perplexing part of this whole thing, Sagar, is like, you can see where this leads. This leads to their destruction. And they cannot get off the course.
I can't decide whether they don't care or whether they're just totally fine with it, or really if they are just totally blind to ideology. I think it is ideology, because I know how the pipeline works here in Washington, which is that you come here, you have to read, all the right books, you have to go to the, the classes, and you sit through these indoctrination seminars.
All the magic words.
Where people from the Koch Foundation read you from this book called I Pencil and the Libertarianism. I mean, you begin to really imbibe it and believe it. I mean, the real thing is, though, this is what always mystified me, is we were here in 2016, right? Like, you're getting indoctrinated. This is my personal story. You're getting indoctrinated on one hand. You turn on the news and you see Trump win by 30 points on the other, and you're like, what is happening here? They're like, this is not explained by any of that.
Right.
That didn't work for a lot of people. I think it's because I wasn't too far into the system. Yeah. That's actually what I think. I think I had not made money off of it. I had not internalized. I didn't need it to be true for my employment prospects. So at that point, then that's really what happens. But the question is now, when so many of these people are about to be out of work, what are they all going to do? Right. Whenever they all lose, you only need so many lobbyists, GOP lobbyists, in a Biden administration.
Corporate PR specialists or whatever.
Yeah, right. It's like, how many stupid consultancies are you going to open during Joe Biden's presidency?
I mean, actually, honestly, it kind of seems like there's an endless number of those freaking things. And that is the piece, is like, on the one hand, you have what is actually a very normal human thing, which is if you have had this ideology that has been like the bedrock of your thinking and what you've been talking about, the way you've been structuring, things you've been advocating for, like your whole way of viewing what is transpiring on a political and economic level, if you have that thing like central to your core, it's very hard to question that thing. Like it shakes you to do so,
that's
right?
true.
So there's like a human, that's what ideology is, impervious to facts and data. In fact, sometimes when you get countervailing facts and data, it actually makes you stronger in your ideology. That is what an ideological like foothold is in these people's brains. And then on the other side, there's no pain really for holding on to that ideology. I mean, Paul Ryan, he's doing just fine.
He's on the board at Fox.
John Boehner, they're all doing
John Boehner's cashing the pot industry's checks.
Just fine. So look, they don't want to lose. They don't want to be in the minority, although in some ways being in the minority, as you pointed out, is actually more comfortable. They know how to run that playbook. That's no problem whatsoever. But even where their own reelection is at stake, it's not like they're going to fall off the end of the universe if they lose. They're going to land in a cushy job. So there's really no price to pay. There's no personal interest at stake in having to do that hard work of grappling with the mythology that you have internalized over decades. And so I think, I mean, if you poll the American public, you get like 80% in favor of the unemployment benefits. It's certainly something like state and local aid is like completely non-controversial. And yet they can't bring themselves to do it. They cannot bring themselves to do it. And it goes against not just what the American people want, but also what you can't even explain it through like, oh, all the donors want them to do this. Some of the donors are ideological too, but some of the business, they're not pushing for this either. It just is truly like this lockhold that this ideology has on their brains that even when faced with electoral disaster, they can't let it go.
No, they can't. But you know what? Maybe that's what needs to happen. I've considered it, which is, look, 1932 and that election, the GOP Congress at that time actually was acting very similarly to this one. During the Great Depression, they got wiped out. The Republicans didn't rule again until the 1950s under Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ideology changed quite a bit under Eisenhower, right, in the way that he governed. So I think that maybe that's what's on par, which is it could be 20 years in the wilderness, and it could be a battle between folks like myself and then the libertarians, like I was talking about in my radar today. It's going to take a long, long time in order to stamp out the ideology for a lot of these people. Maybe they need to lose 2 or 3 times before their grip on power is finally gone.
It just shows you, we've been talking here for a while about how encouraging it is when it's like the cynical thing to do, like to do the right thing.
Yes.
I think that this shows that that's not going to be enough. Even when it's in their best interest to actually do the right thing, these particular individuals still cannot be brought.
That's right.
Like kicking and screaming, they still cannot be brought to actually doing the right thing. So yeah, there's no solution other than bringing in different people.
Good luck, folks.
Next on Rising, Republicans finally announced, as we have certainly been discussing, their long-awaited coronavirus stimulus package. We're going to find out from Jeff Stein what the absolute latest is. That when Rising returns.